I think they're really interesting. They're also really disgusting too. My mom had Giardia. She came home from India, and my mom is really smart, but she's like, it reminds me of myself sometimes. Have you guys ever seen that Far Side comic where it says like school for the gifted, and he's like pushing it, it says pull? That's totally me, but also my mom. So they all went to India, and my sister is a doctor, so my sister prescribed her antibiotics to take with her. Usually you would take azithromycin, take a Z-Pack with you, just in case, if you're traveling to a place where you might get an intestinal infection. And so she had it with her, and she didn't take it when she first got the infection, which actually, even though antibiotics, you don't take them for protozoa, signs show that it can help like right at the start of infection. So, but she didn't take anything. I'm sorry, what?
Antibiotic?
Yeah, I'll tell you about why later on, but yes.
Okay.
When we get into the diagnostic section, I'll show you what's going on there. But she didn't take anything for it. She knew she was sick, but she didn't know what it was. She thought maybe she had E. coli, something like that. She ended up with Giardia. This is what a Giardia infection looks like. It's disgusting. But, it's not a small portion of the people who live in other countries live with Giardia infections. They just live with Giardia. And it's just part of life. So for her, she almost died. She was down to like 80 something pounds, and she's already little anyway. And then she could not get rid of it. So they gave her antiparasitics multiple times. They didn't work. She eventually got some sort of off-market drug that a friend of a friend had heard that might work, and they shipped it to her from Long Island, and she took it and it cured it, thank goodness. But the CDC called her because when somebody in the United States has an infection like this, we're going to talk about what the cysts are, but they can survive out in the environment, and other people in your house can get infected so easily. Animals can get infected and things like that. But she ended up getting Giardia from a different country, so they called her and tried to figure out why and what was going on with that. But Giardia we do get here as well. So Giardia here, it's a different strain, but same organism. But it's called beaver fever. Have you guys heard of beaver fever? So I guess it's because of where I grew up, why I heard about it so much. But I grew up in Tahoe, in South Lake Tahoe, and a lot of people drink from the streams. And because they're drinking from the streams and there's animal feces that run down into the water, the Giardia lives in the water. So you're not supposed to drink from natural spring water if it hasn't been treated. Or there's something that you can use now that are called a life straw. So you bring a life straw with you if you hike or backpack, so that it'll filter out cysts from protozoa. So protozoa, I'm going to try and put it into a little bit of context of like where we are with our organisms that we've been talking about. So we've been talking about, I don't know where my little clicker guy is. Okay. So we've been talking about, so bacteria is not on here, but here are fungi that we've talked about. Oh, prokaryotes, they are on here. They just called them prokaryotes. So here's a bacteria that we've talked about. Here's a fungi that we've talked about. And we've talked about viruses. This is a bacterial virus. We haven't really talked about prions. We can go back and cover that at some point. But here is our protozoa. So we're here and we're going to finish off the semester talking about helminths. So protozoa, some of the terminology can be a little bit confusing, but just stick with the word protozoa. Sometimes they're called protists or protists, depending on who you're talking to. And what a protist is it's a protozoa. So if you look at it like on the tree, I want to talk about this before we leave today, so I don't want to forget. So these protozoa are protozoa are parasitic protists. So they are protists, and if you hear the word protist, but usually the non-parasitic all belong in one category, the parasitic belong in another category. I won't ever use this term again, just protozoa is what we always say, but sometimes you'll see it called a parasitic infection. And just to be more confusing, sometimes people call a parasite only protozoa, or sometimes people call parasites anything, or helminths also. So I'm just gonna use one term, the only one term I'm gonna use is protozoa, just to help clarify. But just if you ever see those little terms somewhere, sometimes they mix and match. Okay, so here we are on our lovely tree. So we did back to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can I just clarify before,
Yeah.
so if you say protozoa, you're not referring to parasites? For the
Yes,
spots.
they are parasites. So they're called antiparasitics is what they're not antiprotozoan. So parasites, for the sake of this class, are protozoa. Protozoa are parasites is what we use that term for.
Those two columns on the left are kind of interchangeable.
So sometimes they'll call helminths parasites, but we won't. We're gonna call them helminths. We're gonna call these protozoa or parasites. Yeah, sorry, that's a little bit confusing. I just got this off the internet. Everybody says it differently, so depending on what literature you read. So it makes it annoying. But the reason I like the word parasite specific with protozoa is because we're gonna give them antiparasitics. So antiparasitics belong with protozoa. Okay. So here's our phylogenetic tree. We talked about bacteria, we talked about archaea, we talked about viruses, we talked about fungi, which are here. So now I'll show you what we're gonna talk about now. So here, we're not gonna talk about slime molds, those are not parasitic. We're not gonna talk about microsporidia, those are non-parasitic. We're not gonna talk about plants, those are non-parasitic. The only animals that we're gonna talk about are helminths. But the rest of these, entomy, bacilliates, flagella, trichomonids, and diplomonids are all protozoa. They just branch them off into different categories. We're gonna put them all into one category. And that's generally how it's done. They're just a little bit different, but generally it's all put into one category together. But they're very diverse. They're a really huge, diverse parasitic group. Yeah?
So real quick, is it microsporidia? What are those?
Those are like a fungi plant mix, like a hybrid. Yeah, they're like a fungal plant mix. And then slime molds are kind of like a algae plant mix. Yeah.
Are they
Are any of these distinctly algae or?
Distinctly algae would be plants.
Okay.
Plant category. Yeah, probably anything that photosynthesizes, I would guess, is how they differentiated that, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Are slime molds different than the molds that are fungi?
Yes, those are different. Yeah, those slime molds look like slime. They look less moldy,
Why do they
more
call them
slimy.
molds?
I don't know. I know, these taxonomists, they drive me nuts. They really are, not that they have an easy job. Taxonomists do not have an easy job. Plus, you have to agree across 13, 15 countries who really care about this stuff. So you have to internationally decide on a name, and you have to give props to the person who found it and wants to name it, but also staying within the evolutionary branch that it belongs to, the genetic branch it belongs to, what their, where their reproductive capability, so much goes into it. So we can armchair quarterback, but it's not my favorite either. Okay. Okay, so here we are talking about these categories, but we're just gonna put them all into one category of protozoa. So here's the amoeba sisters, they're protozoa. So these are protozoa. And these are all different protozoa. So even though they all belong in our protozoa category, they're very funky and very different, and I want to show you guys so many cool videos, but maybe I'll just post it and you can watch it if you get time. But there's a really cool one on protozoa diversity from Hank Green does this show called Microcosmos, Journey to the Microcosmos, and it's beautifully done. Very, very cool show, so I'll post it. So there's all kinds of different protozoa. We're gonna learn about the pathogenic ones. But like they're just very wild, very crazy, very diverse group. Yeah.
Going back to the previous slide, are we gonna need to know all these ways and the differences and things?
No, I'll show you what we do need to know. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 groups. We'll need to know these 4 groups, and then I'll give you some examples. And then I'll show you pictures of what they look like, because you won't have to identify what they look like for lecture, but for lab, when we get to this section, we're gonna look at them under the microscope, so you'll identify them under the microscope. So you might as well just do it now. Okay. So the problem with protozoa, I'm gonna go over a couple of problems with protozoa, actually. So parasites, we're speaking of protozoa, and they are, you know, when we talk about ubiquitous, everywhere. Ubiquitous means everywhere. And so yes, bacteria are everywhere. We know that, right? We put our hand on an agar plate and it grows a ton of bacteria. Viruses, we know there are viruses on that agar plate, even though we can't see them and we can't grow them. But there are viruses absolutely everywhere, more so than bacteria. And then we talked about fungi, where fungi are everywhere. There are spores everywhere that we don't see, and even though they might not be existing all over the place, the spores are everywhere. And there are a ton of yeast everywhere, on our skin, mouths, ears, eyes, everywhere. So, but parasites, protozoa are more specifically in water, but there's a couple other problems with it too, so I'll show you what the problems are. One of the main problems that we're gonna talk over and over about until we die is malaria. So even though malaria is not waterborne, this is a bloodborne disease that are transmitted by mosquitoes. Hundreds of thousands of people have malaria everywhere. So people all over, and how do you control something? How do you control mosquitoes? Well, we have vector control units just for the purpose of controlling malaria, Zika, what's the other one? We'll talk about it, I can't remember off the top of my head, but a lot of mosquito-borne illnesses that we try to control, but if one person, say in Kenya, has malaria, how do you control the person sitting at the park next to them that's gonna be eaten by the same mosquito? How do you control that? So we try to control insect populations, and there are only certain types of mosquitoes that can transmit, so we don't generally have a huge problem here. But also, you know, it's just a giant burden on the population of the world. Both my uncles had malaria. They were both in the Vietnam War, and they both contracted malaria when they were there, and they suffered with it their whole lives, of bouts of night sweats, fever, chills, anytime their immune system gets low. And they say there's all kinds of other secondary issues having malaria. Yeah.
Aren't they trying to kill off the mosquitoes genetically?
Yeah, yes, they're doing all kinds of crazy things to try, and now they are, it's in play right now, but a malaria vaccine that they're trying to, I think they're in the whole trial rounds of a malaria vaccine.
Very cool.
Yeah, they're doing all kinds of stuff because this is a huge problem, and especially for children. So a lot of adults can live with malaria, but children will have a huge problem with malaria, have a hard time surviving with malaria. So we took anti-malaria medication when we were in Africa, and so it prevents the cysts. I'll kind of show you a little video of what it does. But it's expensive for people that live there. They can't live on that medication. And also, it made my daughter sick the whole time we were there. So the whole time she had a headache, the whole time she felt nauseous. We thought maybe she had a bug when we were there, but then after, it's like, okay, now it's been 2 weeks. It's for sure the medication. None of it, we weren't sick. Everybody felt good, except like she'd wake up feeling okay and then feel sick later on the day. And then we took her off it as soon as we got home, and she was bright as day. So there's, you know, side effects of taking medication. They can't take it all the time. It's not feasible. Okay, so here are the protozoal infections that are most common, malaria by far. And then another problem, so this was the little well we went and got water from, this little pond, I guess, that we got water from in Africa when we were up north of Nairobi. And, you know, why I would die from drinking that water. You know, I would probably be sick for days from drinking that water, but they're not, because their bodies have adapted to living with those parasites long term. But lack of access to water. So this is my picture. I took this picture of these two little kids, and she's probably 8 and he's probably 3, and they're moving this little water tank along, and she's carrying another little water tank on her back, and she's way under malnutritioned, and so it could be from lack of access to food, which it probably is a combination, but also parasitic infections. The parasite itself is eating all of the nutrients, so they also that it's lining the intestines, so the feces can't form correctly, and they can't reabsorb water, they can't reabsorb the nutrients, so the feces go straight through, and it leads to malnutrition, but also lack of food, lack of clean water. So there are 2.5 billion people on the planet lack access to fresh water, which is an unreal number. So this is a huge problem with parasitic infections. So yes, bacteria end up in here, like E. coli and things like that. And so people will end up with bacterial infections, but we do worry, I would say we probably worry more about parasitic infections in places like this, because they will set up shop and live there indefinitely. So, you know, where E. coli, it's a balance between what they're eating and if their body ends up getting rid of it or whatever, but protozoa are a little more hardy and can set up shop and live there for a long time. So yes, they're ubiquitous, but they're ubiquitous in certain places. So like this is just a sample of water. So if you took a little sample of pond water by your house, it wouldn't be clear. There'd be all kinds of things in it. And so this is what our water treatment plants do, is kill and filter. But there are, you know, there's living organisms in every body of water, basically. So here's the causes of diarrhea. I don't want you to memorize this, I just wanted you to think about it. One thing I wanted to bring up with this too is that as you know, we go through this class, we're always thinking, oh, is it bacterial, is it viral, is it a protozoa, is it helminth, is it a fungal infection? But don't forget that probably 9 times out of 10, your patients here, it will be because they ate something they shouldn't have eaten. They ate a big old burger and it didn't sit right, and now they have gastrointestinal problems because they're not eating in a healthy diet, or they have some sort of colitis, some sort of colon problem, because they're not eating properly, versus it's less likely a parasitic infection. Where if you travel somewhere and you're setting up shop as a clinician, then you're like, oh, it might be a parasitic infection, it might be more likely. Yeah.
Are the chronic digestive disorders that are similar in symptoms to colitis, like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, are those parasitic related infections? Or?
Yeah, great question. They're probably not. They're probably diet related. Yeah. So a lot of people, if they don't eat enough fiber, for instance, it's just one example. If your patient's not eating enough fiber, their colon isn't working well, and so they don't have that peristaltic contractions that the colon needs to go through. So then their colon gets it's atrophied, so the colon isn't working as well and can't move the feces through as well. And so they are, even though sometimes they're overweight, sometimes they're malnutritioned, and so that can cause all kinds of problems, but also it can cause necrosis of the bowel and all kinds of other things. But sometimes it can be, and there's more and more research going into what type of bacterial infection they might have that is exacerbating the problem. Because, you know, bacteria like to eat cellulose, they like to eat plant fibers. And if somebody's not giving them what they want to eat, then they'll die, and then they get some sort of secondary infection because those ones died, and then they have problems from the bacteria that's not supposed to be there. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so here we're going to go into our classes. So here's how we're going to classify and memorize our protozoa. We're going to classify them and memorize them by their motility, their methods of motility. So amoeboid, these are also called Sarcodina, but we're not going to memorize that word. We're only going to memorize amoeboid. There's ciliated, which are also called Ciliophora, but we're not going to memorize that word either. We're only going to memorize ciliated. The next one is flagellated, or flagellated, however you want to say it. And those are called Mastigophora, but we're not going to memorize that word either. And then non-modal are called apicomplexan, or sometimes I've seen them called sporozoans, but we're not going to memorize either one of those. Those are non-modal. So we're just going to memorize amoeboid, ciliated, flagellated, and non-modal. Those are our 4 classes. So if you see if you're reading about protozoal infections from around the world, you'll see these terms, Sarcodina, Ciliophora, Mastigophora, but I mean, if you go into this, you will need to know that, but unless you go into that branch of healthcare, you won't need to know that. Okay. So let's go through one by one. So here we are with amoeba. So this is our first one, our amoeboids. And so one example is Entamoeba histolytica. So Entamoeba histolytica is an organism that we worry about a lot. And this is a protozoa. So a protozoa, remember, is a single-celled eukaryotic organism. So it's a eukaryote, it's not a prokaryote. They have a nucleus, they have mitochondria, they have a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum. They have ADS ribosomes. They have a cytoskeleton, cytoplasm. They have the phospholipid bilayer on the outside. They don't have any other characteristics, basically, than we do. They don't have very many other characteristics than we do. I'll show you what we know automatically what that problem's going to be, but they are more similar to us than fungi or anything we've talked about so far. Yeah.
Are all protozoa single-cell organisms?
That's a good question. Yes. Can I say yes? I'm gonna say hypothetically yes, because there are, yes, because those aren't considered protozoa. I'm thinking of a couple examples, but I don't think they're called protozoa. So I'm just gonna say yes. Okay. So here's an amoeba. So this is a weird looking little animal, right? It's a single-celled organism, and it's pathogenic. I'm just giving you one example of each one, or a few examples of each one that are the most common parasites, but there are other parasitic amoeba. This is just one example, and this one is very common. Yeah?
Would it be helpful to have the examples memorized?
Yes, but more so for lab. Let me think about it. Because I will ask you, I would just say yes. Just do it, just go for it, and memorize the examples, because we're gonna have to know them for lab anyway, so let's just go for it. And hopefully it will help you anyway, because you need to know what they look like, right? Because this is an amoeboid. And the amoeboids move around by what are called pseudopods. So pseudo means like false, and pod means feet. So they're like false feet. So they have these pseudopods, and they move around like a slime, like in the movie Slime, or whatever it is, or whatever movie that is, where they move around and they reach out and envelop things, and they shimmy all over. So this is what causes amoebic dysentery. So amoebic dysentery is a problem around the world, and do you guys remember what dysentery means? Bloody stool. Yes, so it's an amoeba that causes bloody stool. So generally, if there's blood in the stool, you know, that you might, I don't know if you'd always be assuming it's a parasitic infection. Let me ask my sister about that, because dysentery is not very common, actually. Bloody stool is not very common, and sometimes it can be just from an infection. Not an infection, I don't want to say infection, because then you would assume it's from
gastroenteritis.
gastroenteritis.
So it doesn't have to be just from,
Yeah, and is that very common that people get bloody stools from gastroenteritis?
I don't know, stress, maybe sometimes.
Or maybe it's like the beginning of Crohn's or something, or
It's a
I don't know.
regular recurring medicine.
Regular recurring Crohn's symptom. Yeah, I'll ask my sister how frequently she runs into that. So,
Aren't they also worried
bloody
that
stool is not very common.
I was gonna say, don't they usually worry that it's cancer too?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so second leading cause of death, you don't need to know any of that. You don't need to know anything other than what's in this little box. So the transmission is fecal oral, which we're gonna talk a ton about transmission coming up soon. So if you know it's enteric, you know it's fecal oral, right? Because if it lives in the intestines, somehow it got out of the intestines and got into somebody else's mouth. So that's fecal oral transmission. And we'll talk about all the different types of fecal oral transmission and how that occurs. But you don't have to know any of this stuff. Just know that it's Entamoeba histolytica, causes amoebic dysentery, and it's an enteric infection. This belongs in our amoeboid class. Pseudopods, they have false feet. Okay, here's our ciliates, and really we only really know of one ciliate that's pathogenic, and it's this one. It's Balantidium coli, which kind of sounds like Escherichia coli in a way, right? It's like E. coli is a bacteria, B. coli is a protozoa. So these move around by cilia. They have these little things around the outside. We'll look at some examples in the lab where they have these little waving cilia on the outside of their cell, and that's how they get around. That's how they filter food through their cytoplasmic membrane, and how they eat. So they can get into the intestines and cause an intestinal infection. They're enteric. Okay, yeah.
So that's a coliform, correct?
Yes,
So-
coliform.
Our lab that detects coliforms is an EMB.
Yeah.
So that detects protozoa.
Protozoa you can't grow on agar. They won't grow on agar. But I mean, a fecal coliform, the word coliform more means like it's a organism that we would use to show that there's feces in the water. So we use the EMB plate to show if there are fecal coliforms. If there's fecal coliforms present, there's feces in the water, so that it's improperly treated. Does that kind of make sense? So we wouldn't
related to
use this as an identifying organism, really, because it's too hard. You know, I guess you could.
You
So,
can find a way to grow it.
well, what we do is we look at stool samples. So,
Or a,
yeah, so we do ova and parasite stool samples. So I'll show you that. So if your patient has if you suspect it's an intestinal infection, then they'll take a stool sample, then put it on the slide, and if there's a parasitic infection, your patient has a parasitic infection. And you could use that to say, where did you drink the water? Where did you get your water source from? What have you been eating? Where is this coming from? But usually we use like the EMB plate as like an alarm bell to show that there's feces in a water source, something like that, yeah. So you would know there are other enteric organisms in that water source because that E. coli test was positive. Because you're like, well, there could be anything in there. Does that kind of help? I don't know. Okay. Okay, so this one we're not gonna memorize. I don't want you to memorize this one. But the reason I put it on here is because we're gonna look at this one in the lab. So when we get to the lab, this is a single-celled protozoa, but they have this like beginning of a little mouth and like a beginning of little, they're organelles, but they have these little special organelles that even though it's one cell, the organelles act as its own little organism. So that it's a little bit more complex than like one of our skin cells, but kind of cool. But we're gonna look at these in the lab and we'll look at their little cilia moving around, so it's kind of cool. But don't memorize this one, these are paramecium, you'll be able to see that in the lab. Okay, so moving on to our flagellates. So of our flagellates, we're going to learn about a few of them, and these are the most common. Half of the population in developing countries is the estimate, half. They're fecal orally transmitted Giardia lamblia. So these are Giardia lamblia, is the most common species of the genus Giardia, and these are gastrointestinal infections. And you can memorize what it looks like because this one, here, let me draw these ones. So this one is just like a circle and it's got these little cilia on the outside. Giardia lamblia looks kind of like an alien. That's what Giardia lamblia looks like under the microscope. Okay, and then here are two more flagellates that we're gonna learn about, but I only put one on our memorizing list here because this one is less common. I just wanted to bring it up so you don't have to know this one, but I do want you to know this one. So this one is Trichomonas vaginalis, and that's gonna be one of our note cards, so you'll know to become more familiar with that one. So this is a sexually transmitted infection. Sometimes people call it trick, is the layman's terms for it. So even though it's called Trichomonas vaginalis, obviously because it's sexually transmitted, males and females have it. So it lives in the urethra of a male or in the vagina of a female. And these almost look a little bit more like B. coli, but they have flagella. And sometimes they have, they have that little wavy pattern on them too. They have more flagella. And I won't do the wavy because I'm gonna get confuse you. So these ones look more round and they have a lot of flagella. But these look very different. And you know, my sister who is a physician will do a vaginal swab to see what is wrong with her patient, and this is what it looks like in the microscope. Every 5th, 8th, 10th patient that has some sort of vaginal infection, that's what it is. So it's more common than you think it is. Sexually transmitted, yes. So Trichomonas hominis is intestinal, and it's fecal oral, but actually they have realized that a lot of people have this. So they're like, well, is it parasitic or is it not parasitic? Is it commensal? Is it not commensal? We don't really know. We don't really know what the effects are on the gastrointestinal system yet. I just wanted to throw it out there because I thought it was interesting, but and just so to broaden your, like, there's not just one Trichomonas. There are different species within that genus. So 3% of women, 3.7 million people in the U.S. Infection. So here we're going to talk about why we're giving them antibiotics. So for the sake of this class, we're going to stick with antiparasitics are for parasites, antibiotics are for bacteria, antivirals are for viruses. But there are a couple antibiotics that they can use broadly for other things, but we'll talk about that later just as an exception. Don't memorize that. Okay, so we have two more. We have two trypanosomas that we're going to memorize. So trypanosomas are much smaller and they look almost like, maybe like little worms. I don't know, you guys looked at them in the microscope. Dr. Wiglino, did you think, I don't know, was it too hard to see because it was so small with the blood? Or Dr. Parakilis, did you guys see it? It's like the purple,
Oh, no, you can see it. There's just like a little purple blob.
little purple, like, kind of, like, could you tell it was like, looked like that? Like that? Yeah, yeah. So they kind of look a little bit like worms, but what they have on them is they have a lot of flagella, and they have this flagella that goes all the way along their cell. So the cell has this long flagella and then also has a flagella at the end. So these are trypanosomas. So trypanosomas are also a large problem around the world, but not as much here. They are bloodborne. So the reason that these are tricky, in my opinion, is because we only look under the microscope. Oil microscopy, we only look at two things under the microscope. Under oil microscopy, what are they? Do you remember? Blood and bacteria? Blood and bacteria. So blood and bacteria. So these are erythrocytes. So we won't ever trick you and ask you what it is under oil unless it's a bacteria, just so you know. If it's a bacteria, it's under oil. If it's not a bacteria, it's not under oil. But the reason I don't really love that very much is because these are tiny. They're small, and they're small as red blood cells. But these are bloodborne. So Trypanosoma cruzi causes what's called Chagas disease. So Chagas disease is common around the world, and especially more towards Mexico, Central America, South America. And it's insect-borne. So these are both blood-borne, they're both insect-borne. And these are from these kissing bugs, and they call them kissing bugs because they bite on the face while people are sleeping, and that's how the infection gets into the bloodstream. That's how these little trypanosoma get into the bloodstream, is through the bug. It lives in the bug, is the host, is not the host, is the reservoir. So the bug is the reservoir, and they bite the host. Yeah.
Are those box elder bugs?
This one?
Yeah.
All I know, I haven't heard that term before, but I could be wrong. I'm not sure.
Okay.
All I know is kissing bugs.
Those are local, right? Those bugs.
Not that I know of. I think they're more southern, warmer
Then they're not- if-
areas, but I could be wrong. We don't have trypanosoma here. Yeah.
Okay, then
Yeah.
they're not box elders.
Oh, yeah. No, we don't have trypanosoma here. Yeah. They're worrying about it more because it is more encroaching on the southern or the northern part of Mexico because of the heat. But so we don't really have Chagas here. And then here's Trypanosoma brucei. So cruzi, brucei. Trypanosoma brucei, they look exactly the same. This is called African sleeping sickness, and I'll tell you why that word makes sense. And they're also getting the blood, and these are from tsetse flies. So it's TSE, tsetse flies. And those flies, they bite and they get into the bloodstream. And the reason it's called sleeping sickness is because when somebody has a bloodborne infection like malaria or trypanosoma, Chagas or African sleeping sickness, then if it's affecting the red blood cells, then your patient will feel tired because they're not getting enough oxygen to the brain, they're not getting enough glucose in their cells. So they struggle with basically oxygen deprivation. So it does make your patient feel malaise or tired, and sometimes they can get like a fever, like a full body symptoms from bloodborne infections like fever, chills, flu-like symptoms, things like that from having a bloodborne infection. So it's 300,000 people in the United States. We do have it in the United States, but actually it's not transmitted very often in the United States. maybe this is new, because I do think that I can't remember. Yeah.
Does it have a structural resemblance to a helmet for any particular reason, or is that just like a visual?
Yeah, no, they're not. I wouldn't even think of them helmet at all, because helmets are multicellular always, and
Okay,
they're
I
big,
know
and
what
they're,
you're saying.
big in comparison, yeah. Yeah, they're very protozoa-ish. They're just like, they just have like the little kind of snaily shape, yeah.
It's just a common worm or something.
Yeah, worm-like, yeah. So, yeah, I guess it is more common in the United States, I forgot about that. So I was thinking that it was a problem that's exacerbated by climate change, and that's why it's been more so in the news, but I thought it still was in Mexico, but apparently not, it was not here, so I forgot. Okay, so Leishmania, this is our last one. So here's Leishmania, and this has several species of the Leishmania genus, and this one kind of looks like sperm? I don't know. These are a skin infection. We'll call it a skin infection. They're insect-borne as well that are on sand fleas. And these are actually Leishmania, or Leishmaniasis is the disease. It's actually really common. I mean, not as much here, but it is common around the world. So I'll tell you why this is a skin infection and why this is enteric, STI, blood. This is the only skin one. I don't know if you can kind of get a sense of why you think that might be, but we'll talk about it. Yeah.
So are all of the protozoa unicellular?
All of them are unicellular.
Okay.
Yes, all unicellular. It is tissue tropism, but think about the organisms themselves, like why they would live here versus here. You guys think about it? It's a candy one.
To get food?
To get oxygen. Awesome. So those are the only aerobic. They're strictly aerobes. They have to have access to oxygen, and they cause a skin infection. Okay. So this one I don't want you to memorize either because this is non-parasitic, but I just wanted to throw this up there because you can compare. So this is Euglena that we're gonna look at in the lab, and this is a single cell protozoa. It's got a flagella. It's got a flagella, and we'll look at these and watch them swim around when we get to this lab section. Okay, so then our last category here, I ran out of room, so I moved it over here. Our last category are non-modal. So here's our non-modal ones. So these ones they just sit there. So as you can imagine, if they just sit there, the transmission is a little bit different, I would say, but there's a way they get around, and we'll talk more about that on Tuesday. But so these are our 1, 2, 3, 4. So crypto, cyclo, toxoplasma. Crypto, cyclo, toxoplasma. So it's cryptosporidium that causes cryptosporidiosis. Sorry, that's wrong. Sporidiosis. That's an intestinal infection. I'll give you more context so that these will be easier to know. Cyclospora is cyclosporiasis. That's gastrointestinal. Toxoplasma is toxoplasmosis. That can be anywhere. And Plasmodium is malaria. So this is our protozoa that we worry about probably the most out of any other protozoa, because we worry about malaria a lot. And it's in the blood, just a side note, it's in the liver, but you can forget about that. So they look like, they have these two different forms. These are, we're not gonna worry about that right now, we'll talk about that on Tuesday, but these are the trophozoite and these are the cysts, so they live in two different forms. And we worry about that a lot clinically. So here's a little bit more information about them. You can look at how common they are, and I'm gonna show you some examples. So cryptosporidiosis this is the reason why in areas of flooding, when there's floods, then the flood water gets into the groundwater, that gets into the water table, and then it bypasses the water treatment plant, and people's water can be water that just came from the flood. And when people's water just came from the flood, this is generally what they'll get. They'll get this cryptosporidiosis, I keep saying that. Cryptosporidiosis. So cryptosporidiosis is why, like, we don't get it very often because we don't get flooding very often, but in southern states and like Texas and Florida and Georgia and Alabama, places where they get like severe flooding and it's warm, and there's the flood water will get into drinking water, then that's why they say boil your water. So they'll have these big boil water notices all over town. They'll give out free water. They'll have it on the news. Don't drink your water, boil all your water. It's most likely because it's crypto. So I didn't put these news, I was gonna put these little news podcasts on here, but I didn't want you to care about that or watch them later. But just so you know, they're in the news frequently. So this was just fairly recently in the news in the South that there was a cryptosporidium outbreak. And then, so that's our main one that we worry about, fecal orally. Yeah.
On that, you said that it was like just after the flood people worry about it. Is there a time component?
Yeah, when the water drops down and then the water can pass back through the treatment center, then it gives people like, so they'll give it so many days after the flood has dropped, and then yeah. Were you gonna ask a question, Dr. Myers? Okay, so here's cyclospora. So this is cyclosporiasis. So cyclosporiasis, one of the problems with this one is that I don't care that you know this, just know what it is, that it's a non-modal protozoa and it's gastrointestinal. But the problem is symptoms don't show up for this one for a while. So that's part of the problem with a cyclospora infection, is that the symptoms, that gastrointestinal symptoms won't show up. And so they can pass it around to their family members or pass it around without knowing it. So cyclosporiasis, a lot of times people will get this from swimming pools. So public swimming pools, as you can imagine, are a cesspool for fecal oral transmission because bums are just not that clean, and they're, it's like depending on how the chlorine treatment versus how many kids are in there and all that kind of stuff, that they can get an infection. But also people that swim in like ponds, then they can get cyclospora from animal feces that have run into the pond. Okay, so this one was in North Carolina. This is fairly recently. 200 plus reported cases in that area. Okay, so toxoplasmosis. So toxoplasmosis is a little bit different, but have you guys ever heard of when a woman is pregnant, she's not supposed to clean the cat litter box?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason that a pregnant woman is not supposed to clean the cat litter box is because of toxoplasmosis, because it can cause huge birth defects, if not fetal death, because of a toxoplasmosis infection, because the fetus itself can get the infection and it can get into any kind of tissues. This one doesn't really have a tropic tissue of choice, kind of like Staph aureus, it can go anywhere. So it's common in cats, are the reservoir generally, but it can be anywhere. Meat, sometimes like undercooked meat, people can get toxoplasmosis from that. Toxoplasmosis is, we process our meat here differently in this country but other countries, but also people who eat wild game, toxoplasmosis is a huge problem for people who eat deer, like venison, or bear or whatever they end up eating from, because that animal can be infected with toxoplasmosis. One problem where this protozoa likes to live is in the retina, so they can have ocular toxoplasmosis, which can lead to blindness, which is a scary thing. 11% of people in the United States have been infected at some point in their lives, and around the world is more than 60%. And so here are just some news articles that are common. This was from UC Davis, that they did a study on how many feral cats in the area had toxoplasmosis, so it's more common than you think. Yeah?
So do you know when you're infected?
Not always. Yeah,
So that
you don't
11%.
always have symptoms. Yeah.
So that 11%, a lot of them probably didn't know.
Probably don't know if they have symptoms. Yeah, yeah. Okay, and our last one, this is the biggie. This is Plasmodium falciparum. We'll have for our note card. You don't have to worry about that until we have our note card. But this is what is the cause of malaria. 290 million people infected per year worldwide. So many, right? That's insane. So I'm gonna have you guys watch this on your own. I don't want you to memorize it. I just want you to, what I want you to get out of that video is a sense of the complexity of the transmission, of all the stages of that a protozoa goes through in the infection process, and how difficult it might be to treat them. So some of the more common species are malariae, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium vivax. And it would be easier if I made our note card Plasmodium malariae, because you'd be like, oh, that's what causes malaria. But it's actually not the most common. The most common is Plasmodium falciparum. So that's gonna be our note card. That causes malaria. A lot of people are gonna get confused what those two that coordinate together, Plasmodium, malaria, malaria, Plasmodium, don't forget. So that's a video, you guys can watch that. So still endemic, remember that term endemic, in 85 countries, and I would guess that's a low estimate. So when I was working at the clinic in Nairobi, every third person that came up said, I have malaria. So many people. And a lot of times that's a biased, head count that I'm taking, because those are the people that are coming in that are sick, right? So the people that are coming in that are sick are probably having complications from malaria, or HIV or things like that. But does that mean everybody has it? No, but it is very, very common. Okay. And they have been having cases recently in Florida, so they are really worried about it here as well. And once a larger percent of the population gets malaria, it's hard to control. But also, having vector control, mosquito control, things like that. But how many, everybody gets mosquito bites all summer long. It's just a thing. So controlling that is very difficult. It's a species of mosquito. Is there anything else I want to say about that? Okay. Most eukaryotes have the same organelles. Some are photosynthetic, some protozoa are photosynthetic, but we don't care about the ones that are photosynthetic because they're not pathogenic, right? And so one question is, do they have a mitochondria? Yes, they all do. So they all have a mitochondria, but we're gonna talk about why some of them, let's talk about it later. I don't want to get too crazy about talking about metabolism yet, because I'm just going to confuse you. Okay, so Entamoeba histolytica. So I don't want you to memorize any of these funky little structures on the inside. I'm not going to ask you anything else on their internal structure except what is a normal eukaryotic cell. So I just want you to know that some have little special things about them, even though their cells are very similar to ours. So some have these little, these ones don't have micronuclei, but yeah, they just have different structures, depending on what type of organism it is. So some have like micronuclei, they have little dividing nuclei that branch off of the main nucleus. They have little structures for osmoregulation, that kind of thing. Okay, so this is is it up there? Oh yeah, that's Giardia lamblia. So remember, this is the little alien with the little eyes. These are both nuclei. They have 2 nuclei. So they have some little special and unique structures. This is a Plasmodium falciparum. This is the non-modal, and they do have all of the organelles that we've talked about. And that's it. So let's do our note card. So this is what I'm debating, is if we should do this or we should. Because we're done talking about fungi. What do I want to do? Let's do it. Okay, so this is our last fungi note card. So just write on your note card fungi, huge, so that you know that this is not a protozoa. This is our last fungal note card. So this is Coccidioides. Maybe it'll help you to have this as a note card because that word sounds like other organisms. That's a tricky one. So it'll help you to remember Coccidioides is a fungal organism. Coccidioides is the genus. SP means several species. You can draw here, it's a dimorphic fungi. So you can see here are the spaghetti and meatballs. This is the hyphae and fruiting bodies. And then here is just in the yeast form, where this is an infection. You can write 400 times microscopy on all of your fungal cards if it helps you remember. This is a yeast, this is a mold. Dimorphic means it's both yeast and mold, depending on temperature. When it's a little bit cooler, it's a mold. When it's a little bit warmer, it's a yeast. Yeah, so weird. Okay, so here it's dimorphic. The disease name is coccidiomycosis. Coccidioides mycosis. I don't think I spelled that right. I don't know. I have to look that up. It looks like that's not right. I thought it was coccidiomycosis, but I could be wrong. So this is what's called valley fever. And the reason I added this, I forgot that I had added this one, is because I've heard about it in the news a lot lately. Even though it's not very common in this area. And it's been more common, especially this summer, because it's been so hot. And it's kind of traveled up from the southern areas more towards the northern areas. It's opportunistic, or it can be from high levels of exposure, just like normal fungal infections. So people with high levels of exposure can be like hikers, people that work in like kind of wet, damp, moist, warm warehouses, things like that. Usually in the southern United States, California, New Mexico, Arizona, this one maybe likes to be more dry. Respiratory, bronchitis, pneumonia, invasive. It can become invasive because it's a yeast as well. 60% asymptomatic, but you don't have to know that. So I just put one more thing on here, I'll come back to that, is there was an outbreak at a music festival in Southern California. And there was, oh no, this one I'm not going to talk about yet. let's go into diagnostics next time, because it has more to do with, no, I can't talk about diagnostics next time, because we're talking about protozoa. Okay, so let's just do it. So what I think this can help you with is to understand diagnostics, to understand what the patient might be experiencing. So it's a good idea to just read through these and try and, especially, this is why. So what I wanna do actually is pass out two things. So I will split them up and you guys can pass them around. So if you want to take one and pass it around. So this is for our poster project. This first one I'm passing around. Then this second one is for lab. Let me just pass that one. Okay, so what we're doing for our poster project, I've changed my mind on this like 5 times. And the reason I changed my mind on it is because we did something else last semester. So that my first 6 semesters, we've done a project where we're reading journal articles from PubMed and interpreting them, analyzing them, things like that. But the reason I decided to go off that this semester is because last semester I read like 5 of them that were AI, and I was like, do I want to like run these through and then punish people who, it's just not my style. I do not like punishing students for doing, and like, there's this whole thing about AI, like how much using AI is cheating, how much is it not cheating, because it's basically Googling, and what are you copying and pasting? Like, I can't do all that business. So I decided to do a poster project because I've seen other classes do it, and I thought that they looked really cool. So I'm excited about the poster project part of it. The only part I'm a little bit bummed about is that I do want you to teach you how to use PubMed and how to read journal articles. But if you are ever going into research and you want to chat about it, or if you're going into research 2 years from now and you want some advice, reach out to me and I will help you with like how to get through some research papers, how to design a research paper. Last semester I had a student that had to write a research paper, so we sat together to figure out what is your X, what is your Y, how are you going to measure X, how are you going to measure Y, and like we went through all that stuff together, and I think that was really helpful just to simplify it a little bit. So if you do need research help, if you want to eventually write a research paper, or you're going to go into research, then 100% I'm here until a decade from now or whenever. So yes, reach out to me if you have questions about that. But what I decided to do is a poster project. So then my original idea for the poster project was come up with something different, some other organism that we haven't had time to address, like Klebsiella pneumoniae, for example, is what I've seen come up in the TEAS test. I've seen it come up in the NCLEX test, but we just don't have time to cover all the organisms. So we have to cut it short. So I was like, okay, everybody come up with an organism that we don't address. But then I'm like, my goal is to help you understand what we're talking about and to solidify the basics and make sure that you understand. And so really, am I giving you busy work at that point? So I've gone through this whole internal struggle. So now what I've come up with, the final decision is they are going to be our note card organisms. So the reason that I thought this might be cool is because you're basically going to have note cards posted around the room that are a poster size that are helping you with the diagnostics. So going into the final, we talked about that before you guys got here, is how tricky the diagnostics section is of our final. And I have had students struggle with it every semester, a handful struggle with it. And the reason why they struggle with the diagnostic section is because this is how they're memorizing. They're memorizing Staph aureus causes skin, pneumonia, GI, blah, blah, blah. They flip it over, and they know Staph aureus kind of causes everything. It's gram-positive, it's cocci, it's staph-oriented, it's, so they're relating here. But then I ask a skin question, and they're like, they can't pull from the different organisms, which makes sense because it's just a different way to flip your brain. But the reason I emphasize it, and I think it's so important, is because that's how your patient's gonna come in. Your patient's gonna come in with a skin infection, and you're gonna be like, what in the world is this? Like, let me go back all through my note cards and figure out what my patient might have. So hopefully this poster project will help you with the diagnostic mind, but also I think it's a good idea too, as we're going along or when we get to the end, do a note card that says skin and write the organisms that it might be. One that says pneumonia, what it might be. One that says sexually transmitted, what it might be. So helping yourself in that way, but also what our poster projects are gonna be is basically giant note cards. So on the front of the note card is gonna be what your patient's symptoms are and what a picture of your patient's symptoms, but you have to draw everything because I don't want anything AI. Everything has to be hand done. So you have to draw what your patient is experiencing, or sometimes if it's a blood test or if it's something, then you're gonna write like, oh, what does a CBC look like? What does a complete blood count look like? And copy that onto your poster project. I can help you with some of this if you're confused. So the diagnostic section is like, not diagnostic, the history and physical section is part of your poster. So you're gonna take your patient's history, where have they been? What have they been doing? What are their hobbies? Is anybody else in their family sick? Are they, all those kind of questions that go into their history. Then you do a physical examination. What does your patient's throat look like? What does your patient's ears and nose and eyes and skin and any kind of other things, if you take their respiratory rate, if you take their heart rate, any kind of things like that. So all of that goes into your patient's history and physical portion. And then the next portion is what tests are you gonna run? So did I do a stool sample? Am I doing a blood sample? Am I doing a mannitol salt auger? Am I doing it on blood agar? Am I doing a carbohydrate fermentation test? Like any of the tests that we've been doing, or the tests that will help someone who's looking at your poster to diagnose your patient. And then on the bottom part, I forget what the bottom part is supposed to be, is a picture, drawing of what your organism is. So what does your organism look like? So what I think I'm going to do is cover up, as when everybody posts their posters, I'm gonna cover up the picture section of the organism, and first you'll just get a glimpse around of like, okay, what do I think that this patient has? Then I'm gonna look at what labs they ran. Okay, did they run these labs? That kind of seems consistent with what I think they are. Okay, the last section is, I think I'm right. I think it's bacterial, or I think it's viral. But it's not gonna tell you what bacteria or what virus or what protozoa or whatever. So you're just gonna go around and guess. And then, okay, I've got kind of an idea of what my organisms are, and then everybody's gonna look on the back and go, oh, I was right, or I was wrong, why was I wrong? So it's just gonna be like another round of studying for the final, hopefully. So that will help you with the note cards. Yeah?
Are you going to assign the organisms, or are we?
No, so
supposed
what
to
I
pick?
wanted to do today is give you an opportunity to look at all the organisms. Does somebody have that sheet? Was that in my little thing? Oh, thank you. So I'm gonna I'll give you guys the opportunity, maybe if you guys, before you leave, down to lab, come and look these over. So here's all of our note card organisms here. They're also posted right now on the modules. So they're posted under the modules, and you can look through those. So what we're going to do next time is we'll pull from a hat. So what I want you guys to do is pick 3 organisms that your top 3 choice of organisms that you want to do. So what organisms look like interesting to you, and then we'll just pull from a hat and you just pick what you pick. Does that sound good? Okay. So on your rubric, so this is always the problem that I have. Look at that already. This is the problem 9 times out of 10 I have when grading, is that the student did a really good job, but it didn't follow the instructions. So just make sure that you know what I'm looking for. Read through this section. This is what your poster is gonna look like. You're gonna divide it into 3 sections. Your history and physical section can be shorter. Your drawing of your organism can be bigger. However you want to divide those 3, because maybe your test section you wanna run more tests or something like that. And maybe you wanna trick the students in the class. Maybe you're like, well, I did a carbohydrate fermentation test and they were all negative, because you're comparing two different, like, well, is it C. diff or is it something else? Is it E. coli? So maybe you're trying to guide the other students toward what it is without giving it to them. So maybe you ran some tests that were negative or something like that. So your tests results are in this section, but you can make that bigger if you want to. But however, you have 3 sections. One is a drawing of your organism labeled with, does it have an outer membrane? Does it not have an outer membrane? Does it have a thick peptidoglycan? Does it have flagella? Does it have a polyhedral capsids? Does it have, like, what is that organism? And then your H&P over here. And your H&P, your history and physical, is not always going to be related. You know, it's like, is anybody else in your house sick? No. But I mean, do you always have to ask that? Either no. Just do a broad history and physical. It doesn't have to be extremely detailed of all the millions of things that you could ask your patient. Just try and round it out to where you're asking your patient, you're kind of narrowing down to what your patient might have. It's giving you hints of what you think your patient might have. Okay, but I mean, if your patient comes in with like vaginal symptoms, you're like, well, I'm not gonna do a stool sample. You know, it's like they have either a sexually transmitted infection or they have BV. You know, so something where that section might be shorter or something like that. So just, you can play it by ear as long as there's 3 sections, as long as you're kind of helping the students get there without giving them the answer, because the answer is going to be on the back of your poster of what your organism is. And then one more thing I wanted to say about that is what
size poster are you visualizing?
Oh, I have posters for you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I will go get those. I can go get those. Maybe I'll bring them in on Tuesday, because on Tuesday we'll pick our organisms. On Tuesday I'll bring your posters. What else did I want to say
Do you
about
want everything like handwritten?
everything handwritten?
Okay, and hand drawn.
Hand drawn, handwritten.
Okay.
Yes.
And
But
then
visual's
the
great.
front side looks like this, exactly. And the back side is just the name of the organism?
Backside, your name and the name of the organism. Yes, yes. So on the front, it does not a lot of words. Yes, your history and physical is gonna have to be like age, you know, some history and physical part of it, but your laboratory results should be visual, because really that is what your laboratory results, yeah, you do get a printout for sure, but for the sake of this class, I think it will help to say, like, if you did a carbohydrate fermentation, draw it. If you did blood agar, draw it, something like that. And then a drawing of your organism. So just make sure it looks nice, not too crazy with words, simplify, yeah.
So sorry, this is like
Yeah.
super fundamental if I missed this, but
No, go ahead.
are we like writing our own made up case file
Yes.
and then proceeding from there?
Yes,
Okay.
write your own made up everything, yeah,
And
great.
that's like the basis.
Yeah, yeah, so make up your patient. So that's what I do, is I make up patients when I'm asking you for your final, like, this patient is an elderly patient. Elderly, what does that tell you? Maybe they're immunocompromised. They're more prone to some infection that is for elderly people, whatever it is. So, I think hopefully it will help you with the diagnostics. Okay, what else? Anything else I want to say about that? Don't wait till the last minute to do it. I'm a huge A for effort type of person. I do really like effort and appreciate effort, so do that, put time into it. So these are case studies. So these case studies, I think it'll help you to read through those. Oh, here, I put why these terms are annoying. So why coccidioides and coccidiomycosis sounds like a protozoa. We'll go through that when we go through the next section. Why? Like, let me maybe make a list of the organisms that all sound really similar, so that we can know that is protozoa, that is fungi. I'll make a list for you next time. Okay. I will see you guys downstairs. So make sure that you show Dr. Rosemary your thing right away, your pre-lab lab right away, and we gotta get on it because we have actually kind of a long lab.
Please collect your quizzes.
Oh yeah, collect your quizzes.